Content note: the romance of a rogue contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and the romanticization of stalking. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 8. Bruce Lowry went to the Elixir Hall the following night with Christopher, but there was no Charmian. "I've never known her to stay away before," Christopher said in perturbation. "She must be ill. Can't you find out? Surely the management must know. It's preposterous that nobody has her address," Bruce said agitatedly. He questioned the other members of the orchestra and the cloakroom attendant, but there was nothing to be learned. And then, about an hour after she should have arrived, a note was sent up to Christopher. He read it through and handed it to Bruce. "I can't come tonight, John. I am ill. I felt rotten last night, only I didn't like to tell you. Keep my place open if you can. I'll come back as soon as ever I can crawl. C. Lee." There was no address, nothing to indicate from where it had come. "Who brought it?" Bruce asked. Someone must know who brought it. He went downstairs and made inquiries, but there was little satisfaction to be gained. A boy had left it at the door. Nobody knew who he was or where he came from. "Who ever heard of engaging a girl without some address?" Bruce stormed. "It's unheard of. It's not business." Christopher smiled tolerantly. "If you knew as much of the flotsam and jetsam of life as I do, you would readily understand the desire to hide identity as much as possible," he said quietly. When the interval came, Bruce went back to the Edgware Road. He was miserably apprehensive. Supposing Charmian were seriously ill? Supposing she died! The sweat broke out on his forehead at the mere thought. Charmian dead, and God alone knew what surroundings. If such a thing happened, he would never know happiness again, would never cease to reproach himself. For 3 nights she did not appear, and Bruce began to talk wildly of calling in the police. Christopher let him have his say. Then he said in his grave voice, "From what I know of Miss Lee, she would not thank you for forcing herself into her private affairs. If she wished you or I to know where she lived, she would tell us, you may be very sure. And I think, without egotism, that if she was in need of help, she would send me. In our way, we understand one another." "If she is not at the hall tonight," Bruce threatened, "I shall set about finding her in my own way." But she was there. When the 2 men arrived, she was sitting in her usual place, the violin lying across her lap. She looked thin and pale, and Bruce was quick to notice that for the first time she was entirely without makeup of any sort. She looked more like the Charmian he had known, without the ugly rouge spots and darkened eyes, and a wave of great tenderness swept through his heart as he bade her good evening. She answered him casually, and turned away immediately to greet Christopher with a friendly smile, and the hot color surged into Lowry's face with bitter anger. There were moments when he told himself that her hatred of him was unjust, and then again moments when he knew that it was but part of a deserved punishment. But tonight it seemed hard to bear, and after the first hour he slipped out and walked about the streets, thankful to be away from the noise and the glaring lights and the sight of Charmian's tired face. It had been raining, and the air was cool and moist when he walked down to the embankment and stood looking out over the river. The lights on the opposite bank winked at him like misty yellow eyes, and a pale crescent moon peeped out at him now and then from behind billowy black clouds. It reminded him of a night on the river 7 years ago, a night during regatta week, when a sudden shower of rain had driven everyone under cover, and he and Charmian had stood together beneath the friendly roof of a deserted boathouse. He had wrapped his coat round her to keep the damp from her white frock, and she had slipped her hand through his arm, and for a moment laid her cheek to his shoulder. "There's a new moon tonight. We ought to wish. Look, it's peeping out now from behind the rain clouds. Turn your money and wish, Bruce." What had he wished for? He remembered so well that he had wished for success, fool that he had been, not for happiness, but for the unstable, unsatisfying thing called success. 7 years ago, and tonight there was a new moon again. His hand went mechanically to his pocket, and to the loose change there. He turned it over, jingling the coins together, and looking up at the pale moon. A feathery black cloud had just scudded away from it, and for a moment it stood out clearly against the dark sky. To be given another chance, to make amends, to make her happy again. The thoughts tumbled over one another in his brain. To make amends, to make her happy. It was of Charmian only that he thought now. It was of Charmian only that he thought when presently he retraced his steps to the narrow street where the elixir hall stood, with its bright lights flaring out into the darkness. It must be long past 12, he knew, and he kept on the other side of the road, pacing slowly up and down, till presently he saw one of the orchestra come out, and presently Christopher and Charmian, with Beauty close at their heels. They stood for a few moments talking. Then Christopher raised his hat with his usual theatrical sweep, called to Beauty, and walked away down the street as Charmian hurried off in the opposite direction. Lowry followed her, careful always to keep to the shadows and sufficiently far behind so that she should not be aware of his presence. But her steps soon slackened, and once she stopped and put down her violin case as if its weight wearied her, before she went on again doggedly. The streets were almost deserted. A bored-looking policeman stood at a corner, and once a taxi sped along at a crossroad, but there were no pedestrians, and Lowry grew afraid that the echo of his footsteps would reach her. But she seemed unconscious of them as she went on, till suddenly she turned sharply to the left and disappeared. Bruce broke into a run. He was afraid of losing sight of her altogether, but as he turned the corner he came suddenly right upon her, as she was fitting a key into the narrow door of a dark house. It was impossible to draw back, and she gave a little start and a stifled cry before she recognized him. Then the key fell from her hand to the pavement. "You followed me! Oh, how dared you!" He had expected anger, but it was not anger that brought that broken, tragic note into her voice, not anger that made her cover her face with her hands as if she could not bear to meet the pity in his eyes. It was humiliation, shame, and anything but anger, and when presently she began to sob, weary, helpless sobbing, it seemed to Bruce Lowry that he had reached the very depths of pain and remorse. He had brought her to this. It was his fault that she stood in the dark, poor street at this hour so long past midnight, a sobbing, tragic figure, instead of being in a happy home, an honored, beloved wife. "Charmian, don't! I can't bear it. I only want to help you. I give the rest of my life. Charmian, for pity's sake!" She took her hands from her face and looked up at him, the tears wet on her cheeks. "If you'd wanted to help me, you wouldn't have followed me here," she said. "Do you think I'm proud of this?" She flung out an eloquent hand to the dark, ugly street. He broke out in hoarse agitation. "Let me help you. I've got a little money. I want nothing but your happiness. Let me try and make some amends. Let me do something for you, anything, for God's sake." She lifted a warning hand, glancing up at the windows of the house outside which they stood. "Oh, hush, hush," she implored. "I can't stay here. I must go in. Oh, please." He answered doggedly. "I'll go if you promise to see me tomorrow. It's Sunday. I know you're not wanted at the elixir. Promise to see me tomorrow, and I will go. I must talk to you. I must help you." "Help me," she said scornfully. "I can, if only you'll let me, and God knows I want to." She was silent for a moment. Then she said in a hard voice, "It's too late. Many years too late. It's never too late while we live. Haven't I paid enough for what I did? Are you going to nail me to that for the rest of my life?" His self-control failed suddenly, and he broke out with increased passion. "If I could only find Hardingham! I've him to thank for all this. He made me what I was, what I am, I suppose you would say. He ruined my life." She said nothing, and he went on. "I suppose somewhere he's still a respected man, mixing with the people who would turn their backs on me. It's the rottenness of life that makes it so that money can smooth over anything. But, my God, if ever I meet him again—" He saw her shrink from him, and with an effort he controlled himself. "I beg your pardon," he said more quietly, "but if you were me, if you had gone through what I have—" Charmian stooped and picked up her violin case. "If you go now, I will see you tomorrow," she said. He took a quick step forward, standing between her and the door. "You mean that? You are not just saying it to get rid of me?" She shook her head. "How can I do that? You have seen where I live. What is there to prevent you coming here again?" "It would be easy enough for you to leave before tomorrow." She looked quickly away from him. "I shall not do that, I promise you. And now, if you will please go. And you will see me tomorrow. When, and at what time? In the afternoon. What time? He insisted. She looked up at him. Any time, it makes no difference. I will be at the park gates, the Marble Arch end, at 3:30. Will that do? Yes. But he did not move. He stood looking at her, the ghost memories of the past crowding upon him, and he broke out as if the words had been wrung from him against his will. If we could only have the past over again, Charmian. If we could only have it over again. She swayed a little where she stood and put a hand to her throat as if she were choking. Let me go. Oh, if you have any pity, let me go, she said, and Bruce Lowry stood aside. He waited while she opened the door, and he had a glimpse of a dark, narrow passageway, lit by a single gas jet high up on the wall, of a steep staircase covered with worn linoleum, and a man's hat and coat hanging on a peg. Then the door closed, and he heard a bolt slip home, Then the door closed, and he heard a bolt slip home as he turned and walked away. When he got back to the Edgware Road, he found Christopher on his knees by the fire, brushing Beauty's silken coat. Saturday night toilette, he said, looking up, and pushing the lock of dark hair from his forehead. He rose to his feet. There, what do you think of her now? He asked fondly. Splendid, Bruce said absently. He stooped and patted Beauty's head. Christopher put the brush and comb away in a little box. Well, and did you achieve your object? He asked diffidently after a moment. Yes. With Miss Lee's knowledge? Yes, I spoke to her. There was a little silence. Then Bruce broke out with a note of despair in his voice. If one could only look into the future and see what lies in wait. If one could be warned. We're a lot of toys, Christopher, helpless toys that the Almighty, if there is an Almighty, holds responsible for the things he makes us do. Christopher came back to the fire, and lifting the lid of the teapot, gravely stirred its contents. You don't mean that, sir, he said after a moment. No man in his senses could mean a thing like that. It's hard to understand some things, I know, but we can't hold God Almighty responsible for the things we may do in a moment of passion. You mean that I can't hold him responsible for allowing me to kill a man who is no good in the world? Bruce asked bitterly. Well, granted that you are right. Don't you think he is responsible for visiting my sin upon a woman, as he has done? But for me, Charmian would never have been where she is today. But for me. Christopher shook his head. The beginning of a sin is a small thing and easy to see, he said slowly, as if conscious of his own lack of eloquence. But its end is miles and miles away, an ending one might almost say. He hesitated, looking at Bruce with very kindly eyes. But if one lives, there is always the chance of reparation, he added. The younger man laughed mirthlessly. What can I do? She won't listen to me. She doesn't believe in me. Christopher poured out 2 large cups of tea before he answered. Then he said with deep earnestness, Will it be thought a liberty if I say something very personal to you, Mr. Lowry? Bruce looked up, startled. Say anything you like, he answered. But it was some seconds before Christopher took advantage of the permission. Then he said slowly, Although you have not told me in so many words, I have gathered, naturally, that Miss Lee is the lady who was first in your life many years ago. Yes. Christopher leaned forward and gently pulled Beauty's soft ears as he went on speaking. There is nothing more dangerous or deceptive than trying to reawaken an old passion. We talk of constancy and believe that we ourselves are constant. But are we? Very few of us, I think, after a lapse of years. Life changes, and we change with it, even if it's unconsciously, and you have passed through a terrible time. Are you sure, quite sure, that you are doing the right thing now? Not only by yourself, but by this lady. She must have changed very much in the last 6 years. You must have changed too. Is it fair to her to allow the glamour of the past to blind you to facts as they really are? Fair to try and win her affections again if, pardon me, you are mistaking a handful of sentimental shadows for the real thing? Bruce Lowry laughed. Fair? To her? She cares nothing for me. Nothing. Christopher shook his head. I would not make too sure of that if I were you. Remember that you stand for the past with her, the happy past, which by contrast to life as she knows it now, must seem like a backward glimpse, poor child, into a lost heaven. He stopped speaking, and for long moments there was unbroken silence. Bruce sat staring into the fire. He knew there was much wisdom in John Christopher's words. He knew that no matter how desperately he and Charmian might try to recapture the past, such a thing was impossible. Even supposing she were willing, did he care for her sufficiently? Was he strong enough to take up the broken threads of their lives and make them into something that would yet be worthwhile? She had changed. Oh, how greatly! And yet the change in her, the pitiful change, had not once touched him with even a shadow of repulse or disillusionment, but had only strengthened his desire to help her, to raise her again to the place from which, for his sake, she had fallen. For 6 years he had nursed a thing he had called hatred, and all the time it had been love in a cruel disguise. He had come back to the world with but one desire in his heart, to humiliate her and make her suffer as he had suffered. And now he would gladly have given the remaining years of his life to know that she was safe and happy. What was that, if it was not love? By its grace the dark places of his heart had been swept of all the evil thoughts which like ugly birds of prey had come there to make their home. By its grace he had found himself again, found ambition, and the desire to make atonement. He looked up and met the melancholy gaze of old Christopher across the firelight, and with the sudden knowledge that here was a friend whom he could trust, here was a friend who would not misunderstand, he answered all doubts and questions with simple truth. I would give my life to make her happy again. And that is the end of Chapter 8 of The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day!